A hush swirls through the dim editing room. A paper script trembles in Steve Martin's hands. The camera leans closer as he reads words, lines that were cut, words that almost lived but didn't stay. And his voice, usually so light, so razor-sharp with wit, cracks just a bit. John Candy was very sensitive and very complex, and we really loved each other. What if the laughter you hear on screen masks something deeper? What if the man telling jokes, playing the fool, creating the absurd, what if he also carried a deep love, not just for the craft, but for the people beside him on camera, seen his name in credits, heard his punchlines, but have you ever felt the beating heart beside those jokes? Today, we dig into Steve Martin's most cherished co-stars, not just the ones he worked with, the ones he loved, the people who shaped him, cracked him open, pushed him to places he didn't know existed, and stood by him when the curtain fell. From the bittersweet memories of John Candy's voice in Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, to the long-standing friendship with Martin Short. From admiration for younger co-stars to moments of raw sincerity, Steve Martin has finally exposed the names, the moments, the co-stars that mattered more than the credits. Stick with me, because behind every comic mask lies a story of connection, respect, betrayal, laughter, and sometimes tears. And tonight, Steve Martin pulls back that mask. Chapter 1. Early years and first important collaborations. Before the silver hair and banjo ballads, before the standing ovations on Broadway and the Emmy wins for clever murder mysteries, Steve Martin was a wiry, restless jester crashing through the doors of American comedy with absurdity as his weapon. And while he'd famously call his early stand-up anti-comedy, even in those wild solo acts, there was always something unmistakably drawn to collaboration, something hungry for connection. In 1979, that craving met its first great match. The Jerk, the film that launched Martin from TV variety weirdo to movie star, wasn't just a creative breakthrough, it was an emotional one. It gave him a canvas, yes, but it also introduced him to Bernadette Peters. Their chemistry wasn't just a marketing ploy, it was real, electric, and deeply tender. Off-screen, they would fall into a relationship that burned briefly, but with unmistakable intensity. On screen, their connection translated into a whimsical, heartbreaking, and strange romantic dance, one that reflected Steve's own inner contradictions. The absurdist wrapped around a romantic. He later said that Peters had a warmth that is so rare. And watching their scenes together, it's impossible not to feel that warmth emanating through even the silliest moments. She didn't just match his rhythm, she softened his edges. With her, Steve's performances seemed less like performances and more like personal exhalations. And then came All of Me in 1984, opposite Lily Tomlin, another seismic shift in his trajectory. Where Peters had pulled out his vulnerable side, Tomlin challenged his technique. The premise was absurd. A man possessed by a woman's soul, but their comedic precision made it fly. Martin wasn't just funny, he was physically astonishing, emotionally layered, and comedically generous. Tomlin was the kind of scene partner who forced him to be better, sharper, more agile. He would later say that filming All of Me made him feel like he had finally arrived as an actor. In those early collaborations, Steve Martin was learning that acting, even in comedies, was a dance, not a monologue. His most beloved co-stars weren't just supporting players. They were mirrors, muses, and in some cases, momentary soulmates. And perhaps it was this realization that great art was born not in isolation, but in intimate collision that would shape every relationship, every cast, every performance to come. Chapter 2. John Candy, the co-star who broke his heart. It was 1987. The cold winds of a Midwest winter howled through the screen, and in the middle of it stood two men. One uptight, unraveling businessman, The other, a chatty, oversized shower curtain ring salesman with too much heart and not enough luck. Planes, Trains, and Automobiles was not just a Thanksgiving comedy. It was a quiet masterpiece of emotional timing, and at its center were Steve Martin and John Candy. A pairing so effortlessly perfect it felt like destiny. But what audiences didn't see was the unspoken language unfolding between takes. Steve Martin, famously precise, intellectually wired, always calculating his comedic rhythm, found in Candy something foreign but magnetic. A raw emotionality. A deep well of sincerity that didn't beg for the laugh. It earned it by accident. John Candy wasn't just funny. He was vulnerable. He could swing from zany to heartbreaking in a breath. And Steve, beneath his cool composure, responded to that vulnerability. In Candy's improvisations, in the little glances he gave when no one was looking, Steve saw something rare, a co-star who gave his full self. No holding back, no mask, just aching humanity wrapped in a clown's body. Their chemistry on screen was undeniable, but what developed off-screen was even more powerful. Steve has rarely spoken of Candy with the ease or detachment of a typical collaborator. In fact, when he does speak of him, even decades later, there's a tremor in the air. Years after Candy's tragic and sudden death in 1994, Steve couldn't recount those days without a catch in his throat. In a recent documentary, his voice wavered as he remembered their time together. John Candy was very sensitive and very complex, and we really loved each other. Not liked, not respected. Loved. It wasn't a romance. It was something deeper. A professional kinship that somehow crossed over into something fraternal, even spiritual. Steve had found in John a counterbalance. Where he was guarded, John was open. Where Steve orchestrated the rhythm of the scene, John danced in it. And when John Candy died, it wasn't just the end of a possible second film or a trilogy. It was, for Steve, the loss of a collaborator who had somehow managed to sneak past all the armor. The pain of that loss lingered. In many ways, it haunted his future partnerships. He would go on to create brilliance with other actors, but the echo of Candy's gentle heart remained, a benchmark, a ghost, a reminder that some co-stars aren't just part of the scene. They're part of your soul. Chapter 3. Martin Short, the lifelong spark that never dimmed. If John Candy was the co-star who cracked open Steve Martin's heart, Martin Short is the one who's kept it beating, decade after decade, through laughter, live shows, and late-night texts. Their bond is less of a friendship and more of a long-running love story between two comedic minds who never stopped dancing around each other's brilliance. Their paths first truly crossed in 1986 on the set of Three Amigos, a film that was chaotic in production but magical in casting. Martin, already a comedic heavyweight, met in Short someone who seemed born from the same strange cosmic joke, a fellow craftsman of timing, absurdity, and oddly tenderness. Steve didn't just admire Short's antics, he needed them. "You know in the first 5 minutes when someone's funny," Steve would later say. And Marty was funny immediately. Where John Candy drew Steve into emotional depth, Martin Short offered perpetual motion. He was relentless, effervescent, always turning a phrase, twisting a moment into something new. And Steve, who often approached comedy with mathematical precision, found joy in Short's chaos. He called it volcanic. But underneath the explosions was something even more important: trust. They began collaborating frequently. Father of the Bride in 1991, its sequel, countless joint interviews, and then a surprise: live stage shows. Not just appearances, but full-blown comedy tours. Stand-up, music, improvised dialogue. For a man like Martin, who had long walked away from stand-up due to its lonely isolation, returning to the stage with Martin Short was a revelation. "He's the only person I could imagine doing this with," Steve said. "He brings the energy, and I bring the calm. Together, we find the rhythm. Offstage, their friendship is just as symphonic. There are reports of the two calling each other daily, of shared holidays, of checking in during health scares. They tease each other mercilessly. But beneath the jabs is a love that's rare in Hollywood, a chosen family. Steve, often reserved in his private life, opens like a flower around Short. There's a gleam in his eye when they're together, a comfort that needs no explanation. Their recent collaboration in Only Murders in the Building brought their dynamic to a new generation. And even there you can see it, the instinctive rhythm, the shared jokes beneath the script, the unspoken history that makes every pause between them feel electric. It's no accident that when Steve Martin decided to embark on one of his final long-term creative journeys, he chose Martin Short, because sometimes love isn't loud or tragic. Sometimes it's just steady, a spark that never dims, no matter how long the road or how strange the plot. Chapter 4. Selena Gomez. The unexpected bond that bridged generations. When Only Murders in the Building was first announced, it raised a few well-arched eyebrows. Steve Martin, Martin Short, and Selena Gomez. The pairing felt, at first, like a generational gamble. Two titans of vintage comedy thrown together with a pop star turned actress, known more for Disney Channel and chart-topping heartbreak ballads. But then, something rare happened. The trio worked, not just functionally, magically. Selena didn't try to match Steve and Marty in manic energy or old-school showmanship. She brought something else entirely: restraint, groundedness, a deadpan delivery that sliced through the comedic chaos like a scalpel. And Steve, ever the technician of timing, immediately recognized the brilliance in that choice. He began speaking about her publicly with a tone rarely heard in his interviews. Part admiration, part protectiveness, part genuine surprise. He called her extraordinary, marveling at her ability to play the straight role while still commanding presence on screen. It was, he confessed, a style of acting he didn't expect from someone so young. But it impressed him deeply. And something else happened too. Something more human than just professional respect. A friendship blossomed, one that seemed almost familial. Selena, in interviews, began referring to Steve and Marty as her crazy uncles. They teased her, guided her, protected her, and she, in turn, grounded them, made them modern, reminded them that the world they once ruled had shifted, and they could still dance within it. Off camera, their affection was unmistakable. Steve and Marty attended events with Selena, praised her in interviews, and even publicly defended her from online vitriol. And Selena, for her part, never missed an opportunity to say how lucky she felt to be working with two legends. But more than that, to be loved by them. Steve has always been measured in his praise, especially for younger co-stars. But with Selena, there was no calculation. He was simply smitten, not in the romantic sense, but in the way a man might marvel at his brilliant daughter, or a surprise friend who entered his life just when he didn't think he needed new ones. In the tapestry of Steve Martin's co-star relationships, Selena Gomez is the newest thread, bright, unexpected, and woven tightly into the present. She represents a passing of the torch, yes. But more than that, she represents a rare gift, a late-in-life connection that feels as real, as respectful, and as cherished as any he's ever known. Chapter 5. Meryl Streep, the idol who humbled him. Even for someone like Steve Martin, a man who spent decades sharing the screen with legends, the presence of Meryl Streep carries a gravitational pull. When it was announced that Streep would be joining the third season of Only Murders in the Building, the buzz was immediate, and Steve, a veteran in every sense, seemed just as giddy as the fans. Because this wasn't just another co-star, this was Meryl. Their professional paths had only brushed in passing before. An industry encounter here, an awards ceremony there. But when she stepped into the world of only murders, it was Steve who found himself quietly floored. He called her impossibly brilliant, a joy to work with, and as funny as she is masterful. But what truly struck him wasn't her pedigree, it was her humility. For all her Oscars and revered performances, Streep arrived on set with curiosity, openness, and a willingness to play, truly play, in the comedic sandbox that Steve and Marty had built. And Steve, who often maintained a certain emotional distance even in high-caliber productions, was visibly moved by her generosity. There's a moment, barely noticed in a behind-the-scenes featurette, where Steve watches Meryl rehearse a scene. He doesn't interrupt, he doesn't joke, he just watches still. When she finishes, he claps softly, almost reverently. That's not performance, that's awe. But something else happened during their time together. They clicked, not in the fireworks way he had with Martin Short, or the quiet intimacy he'd shared with Candy, but in a way that felt deeply rooted in mutual understanding. They were both icons playing among the younger set, both seasoned yet still searching for nuance in every line. Meryl, for her part, praised Steve's immaculate comedic timing and noted how safe she felt exploring new dimensions of humor beside him. It wasn't praise tossed for press. It was the kind of compliment that carries weight from someone who rarely speaks in hyperbole. For Steve, working with Meryl Streep was less about comedy and more about reverence. It reminded him of what drew him to the craft in the first place, the thrill of watching someone do something impossible and make it look easy. And in Meryl, he found a mirror, not of his style, but of his soul. A fellow artist, unshaken by decades in the spotlight, still humble enough to care deeply about a single line, a single scene, a single beat. They may never collaborate again. Or they might. Steve has hinted he'd happily write a dozen more seasons if it meant Meryl was in them. Either way, her presence in his world was a kind of emotional summit. Not the loudest love, but maybe the most profound. Chapter 6. Others he cherished. The quiet companions of a storied career. Not every co-star Steve Martin loved made headlines. Some were quieter presences, not icons or scene stealers, but collaborators who left deep imprints in smaller, subtler ways. To understand Steve Martin's emotional constellation, you have to look beyond the spotlight, into the corners of sets and stories where friendships quietly bloomed. Take Diane Keaton, for example, his radiant, eccentric counterpart in Father of the Bride. The chemistry between them was effortless. She played his on-screen wife with such tenderness, such knowing restraint, that their dynamic felt lived in. Steve once said that Keaton was one of those actors who doesn't just deliver lines, she inhabits the relationship. On and off the screen, she made him feel comfortable, safe, even whimsical. Their scenes together pulse with a kind of low-burning affection that doesn't need to be loud to be deeply felt. Then there's Rick Moranis, his co-star in Little Shop of Horrors. Though their screen time together was limited, Martin often spoke highly of Rick's precision, how he could build a world in a look, or steal a scene with silence. Martin respected that kind of craft. He once called Moranis a sculptor in a world of finger painters, a rare compliment from someone who usually reserves praise for timing over flourish. And let's not forget Sarah Jessica Parker, his co-star in the lesser-remembered romantic comedy L.A. Story. She was young, vibrant, unself-conscious. He was older, cerebral, aching for renewal. Their on-screen romance mirrored something deeper, Steve's fascination with the exuberance of youth, and Parker's free-spiritedness pulled something loose in him. He spoke about her in interviews with a wistfulness, as though remembering a summer that ended too soon. There were others. Queen Latifah in Bringing Down the House, who shocked him with her improvisational dexterity. Michael Caine in Dirty Rotten Scoundrels, who matched his wit with Shakespearean command. Eugene Levy, with whom he shared an understated, quiet rapport over multiple projects, and Tina Fey, with whom he never starred in a major film, but whom he admired fiercely, often calling her a beacon for modern comedy. What unites all of these connections isn't just professionalism or chemistry. It's the way Steve talks about them, with specificity, with care. He doesn't use grand phrases like genius or icon unless he means them. But when he says someone lifted the air in the room or made the crew fall in love, he's telling you something important. That person mattered, not just to the movie, but to him. Steve Martin has spent a lifetime in comedy, but he's also spent a lifetime observing, loving quietly, giving affection in controlled doses, but meaning it when he does. The co-stars he cherished weren't always the loudest or the most famous. They were the ones who, even for a brief moment, made him feel less alone in the strange, vulnerable act of making people laugh. Chapter 7. The Ones Who Mattered Most. In a career spanning more than 5 decades, Steve Martin has stood beside countless co-stars, brilliant, bold, beautiful performers who helped bring his characters to life. But when the lights fade and the laughter subsides, only a few remain etched into his emotional DNA. These are the ones who didn't just make him better on screen, they changed him off it. John Candy remains, perhaps, the most poignant. There's something haunting about the way Steve speaks of him, the way his voice still falters even now. Candy wasn't just a funny man. He was a gentle soul who showed Steve that sincerity didn't weaken comedy, it deepened it. That you could be both hilarious and heartbreakingly human. In losing him, Steve didn't just lose a co-star, he lost a creative soulmate. Then there's Martin Short, the ever-present, ever-sparkling firework to Steve's quieter flame. Their bond is unmatched, a friendship that moved past performance and into the territory of chosen family. They've aged together, laughed until breathless, supported each other through the bizarre, slow dance of fame and aging. Steve once joked that he wouldn't retire unless Marty does, but there's truth in it. They are two halves of a rhythm, two instruments perfectly in tune. Without Short, Steve's comedic music might still be beautiful, but it wouldn't be symphonic. And in the unexpected corners of his life, Selena Gomez entered not as a prodigy or a gimmick, but as a balm, a grounding force. She bridged generations, helped him feel young again, relevant again, connected again. She's not a daughter figure. Not quite. She's something stranger and sweeter, a reminder that the heart doesn't age the way the body does, and that sometimes you find new people to love when you least expect to. Even Meryl Streep, a star Steve had no expectation of befriending, left a mark. Her grace, her skill, her humility, all cracked open something reverent in him. With her, Steve wasn't the elder statesman or the comedic authority. He was a student again, an admirer. That kind of humility, that willingness to still be awed, says everything about who he is behind the cleverness. These are the co-stars who mattered, the ones who made him laugh harder, work smarter, feel deeper, the ones who broke through the pristine comedic mask and found the man beneath. Not just Steve Martin, the legend, but Steve, the listener, the loyalist, the lover of people who showed up fully and helped him do the same. Chapter 8. The Legacy Left in Laughter and Love. There's a strange alchemy in Steve Martin's story, a man known for his surgical wit, his intellectual detachment, his carefully crafted absurdism, and yet beneath it all, a heart that pulses with deep and lasting love. Not just romantic love, but the kind that grows between people who show up in your life, change your rhythm, and then never really leave. For decades, Steve Martin was seen as the lone genius, the wild and crazy guy, the man with the arrow through his head and a philosophy degree behind his punchlines. But when you look closely, His most enduring work has never been solo. It's always been a duet, a trio, an ensemble. What he left behind in these collaborations wasn't just great films or TV shows. It was something less tangible and more enduring. Connection, a deep appreciation for the way one soul can elevate another, not by stealing scenes, but by standing beside you, fully present. The co-stars he loved most didn't just make him laugh. They made him care. They disarmed his perfectionism, poked holes in his polished veneer, and allowed something softer to shine through. With John Candy, he learned that vulnerability is a strength. With Martin Short, that laughter can be lifelong. With Selena Gomez, that new generations can carry the flame. With Meryl Streep, that admiration doesn't fade with age. And with the many others, Keaton, Moranis, Latifah, Kane, he found echoes of something more than craft. Kinship. Now, as Steve Martin speaks more openly about retirement, legacy, and the winding down of the stage lights, he does so not with regret, but with reflection. His heart is not heavy, it's full of the faces who shaped his journey, the voices who harmonized with his, the memories that exist in the quiet between jokes. Because Steve Martin, the man, not the myth, was never really alone. And perhaps that's the most beautiful truth he's finally exposed, that behind every perfectly timed joke, there was a hand held off camera, a co-star he loved, and a love that lingered, long after the laughter faded. Chapter 9. The last bow is never really the end. These days, Steve Martin walks a little slower, speaks with a touch more patience, and wears his age not as a burden but as a badge. He doesn't chase the spotlight anymore. The spotlight follows him, drawn not just to his legacy, but to his enduring presence. There's no desperation in his step, no clawing for relevance. He is, as ever, deliberate, observant, quietly moved by the people around him. At a recent red carpet for his documentary, Steve Martin, he stood beside Martin Short and Selena Gomez once again, the past and the present, woven together in one frame. He smiled, not broadly, but with a soft curve in the corner of his mouth. A man who knows he's lived well and, more importantly, loved well. He'll likely never announce a final film, a last performance, a true retirement. That's not his style. He'll just drift gently into the folds of history, remembered not only for the roles he played, but for the people he played them with, for the way he looked at a co-star not as competition, but as kin. In Hollywood, where relationships are often transactional and fleeting, Steve Martin left behind something more permanent, a blueprint for creative love, a legacy not just of laughter, but of emotional honesty, of collaboration without ego, of deep affection masked sometimes by comedy, but never diminished by it. The audience may have come for the comedy, but what they stayed for, what they'll remember, are the people he loved. The co-stars who held his hand through the years, on camera and off, and the man who let them. Because in the end, Steve Martin wasn't just one of the funniest minds of his generation, he was one of its most quietly tender hearts. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and comment down below as it helps support this channel. Also, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell to get notified of our newest videos. Thanks for watching.